the president as well as the rest of the U.S. leadership. We should point out these things are well thought out and planned in terms of trying to protect the American leaders under such attack. There are bunkers in the nation's capital where congressional leaders have been taken. Also the other members of the national security team in the so-called war room in the White House and various other locations. Obviously, at a time like this, newspapers around the country are printing extra editions. This is no exception. This is the Oakland Tribune, normally a morning paper, but they are printing an extra edition, the bold headline, "Attack," outlining as best as we know it and they know it what happened today in New York City, Washington, D.C., and southeast of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We expect that other papers, the San Francisco Chronicle and so forth, will be publishing extra editions today with their information. Obviously, we'll be staying with our coverage from both CNN and Fox and the KTVU newsroom until further notice. Right now, I want to send it back to Frank and Tori.
It's being taken, obviously, to make sure that the president is safe. Essentially, Air Force One is like a flying White House. Anything he could do from Washington, he could also do from Air Force One, correct? Well,
much was made of the president's month-long vacation in Texas, and he said, you know, with all the fax machines and high-tech equipment and secure radios, the White House can move anywhere it wants in the United States, and I wouldn't be surprised that throughout the day we see President Bush move from where he is now at an Air Force base in Nebraska. Essentially, they want to keep him a moving target. He is in communication with the Vice President, Secretary of State Colin Powell, Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Everyone who needs to know can be in contact with each other, the leaders of Congress from various points in the country. And obviously the plan here, the strategy from Washington, D.C. has always been to put all these important people in different locations if need be, to make them less of a target if they were all together as a group, Frank.
All right, yeah, that's what we were thinking the strategy probably was. All right, Mark Curtis in our newsroom. Thank you, Mark. Now, because of the attacks, there is a heightened state of alert in San Francisco this noontime. Mayor Willie Brown has declared the city in a state of cautionary alert. Lisa Beckett is live in San Francisco at the Office of Emergency Services now with more. Lisa?
And at this Office of Emergency Services, we have top law enforcement officials from just about every agency in San Francisco that have been here since this incident happened in New York. This is, of course, an acting command center for the city of San Francisco. As you mentioned, the city under high alert. Mayor Willie Brown signed a limited state of emergency that is specific to the courts and release of police. And at 3 p.m. today, they plan to hold a conference call with Governor Gray Davis in Sacramento to discuss the state situation and the situation here in San Francisco. Let's go ahead and show you some video we shot earlier of the federal building here in San Francisco. It is closed until further notice. U.S. police marshals barricaded off the streets there. They were surrounding it early this morning. We saw some workers there voluntarily leave before the building was even closed down. San Francisco City Hall is also closed, so are all government buildings here in San Francisco. The Transamerica is shut down, B of A, Gas and Electric, 1 California Street is also shut down. Several law enforcement agencies spoke at a press conference early.
I would call it the highest that I can imagine without having an actual emergency. And I have to make it really clear that no emergency exists in the city right now. Everything that you're seeing is simply a planning process. We're trying to cover as much as we can in advance to be ready to deploy for whatever eventuality that does face us.
You know, we really don't know, and hopefully San Francisco will not point any accusatory fingers or attitudes at anybody, but we do have contingency plans to make sure that people are not victimized by hate crimes or any unnecessary emotions.
The San Francisco Unified School District has been closed by authorization of the Superintendent of Schools and the Board of Education. The children who have arrived at schools are being kept there. The parents and guardians can pick their children up at the schools and take them home. Otherwise, they will be kept under the guidance of the school district. No one is being allowed onto school district property without proper ID.
But I think we're in fairly good shape, and the citizens of our city ought to be very comfortable that even in this absolutely unbelievable crisis at New York's level, on Washington's level, on many other places in America, are relatively calm and secure, and comfortable.
And you need to have private security on each of those doors. But with regards to the video camera, what you might do is figure out how many buses you've got. And
there were earlier reports today of threats that were being made in the city, and law enforcement could not confirm if they were related to the New York attack or not. We have not confirmed now, but we did hear police talking earlier about the possibility of 2 car bombs. They have not said where that may be or, again, confirmed if that has happened here in San Francisco. Coming back here live, we can tell you that Muni is on schedule. BART is up and running. They were going to add more trains because there were quite a few people who wanted to get out of San Francisco. As far as bridges are concerned, the Golden Gate Bridge, patrols on and under the bridge. They have shut down the walkway on the bridge to pedestrians and cyclists. As far as the Bay Bridge, they tell us that they have emergency crews in boats, 2 fire boats that are patrolling underneath there, trying to manage the waterways, if you will, to make sure that nothing happens on that front. As far as the city is concerned, you heard Mayor Brown say he wants everyone to stay calm. There is no threat here in the city. We have seen some people driving by, listening to the radios, of course, catching TV wherever they can, everyone wanting to know what is happening on the East Coast. That is the latest for now. Back to you in the studio.
All right, thank you, Lisa. The scope of what has happened here is hard to comprehend. This is, without a doubt, the worst terrorist act in history. And the death toll, we're getting some initial estimates that the death toll is at least in the hundreds, if not the thousands. My brother's wife happens to work at a hospital in New York City. She has told my family that she's not going to be home for a week. They are planning on keeping her at the hospital for the next week to deal with all of the sick and wounded. Also, we're getting word that blood banks here in the Bay Area are asking people to stop coming down unless you have a scheduled appointment. They have been overwhelmed with people who are trying to help out. Obviously, people who are good intentioned, but at this point, they just cannot handle all of the people. They're being overwhelmed. So they're asking people, unless you have an appointment, please do not come down at this time. Of course, in the coming days, there may be a need for more blood, at which time you may be urged to come back. But again, right now, they're overwhelmed and asking you to stay home unless you have a scheduled appointment at a Bay Area blood bank.
And a couple other just important things to note. A good glimpse of the impact of this around the country. Once again, the FAA has shut down airports nationwide. We just heard from Karen Hughes, a Bush spokesperson, that no airline flights will be allowed until at least noon. We assume that's Eastern Standard Time tomorrow, but that is just a temporary timing. Of course, that will could change upon further notice. Also, Greyhound has canceled bus service in the Northeast. Amtrak temporarily suspends train service along the Northeast corridor. All U.S. financial markets are closed. Banks are open, and the Federal Reserve said it will release more money to help cope with this huge disaster that has hit our country. Also, the space shuttle operations have halted. Some 12,000 employees at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida have been sent home. All Major League Baseball games postponed today. Soccer games, major soccer games postponed. Disney World has closed all of its theme parks around the world. The Philadelphia Liberty Bell at Independence Hall is closed. Seattle Space Needle also evacuated and closed today.
Right now, what we want to do is resume live coverage with Fox News.
But they do not understand what had happened in the United States. Those cannot be representative neither of the Palestinian people at large nor of the Palestinian Authority. So we should not really misconstrue the reaction of a few teenagers in the street of Ramallah under siege with the position of the Palestinian people and how we feel in the Palestinian Authority.
Who do you think is a good candidate to look at for the responsibility for these acts?
I think it would be irresponsible from my side or anyone else to speculate at this point. There are American intelligence agencies who are involved in the investigation, and it is only prudent from all of us, and especially from the media, not to speculate and wait until we have sufficient evidence as to who are the perpetrators of this horrible act are.
Can you say, sir, that absolutely there is no Palestinian involvement in these terrorist attacks whatsoever?
I will say that absolutely there's no involvement of of the Palestinian Authority or the PLO. Excuse me, I cannot say who is behind this, whoever it is, whether it is Palestinian, American, Latino, Chinese, Indian, Jewish, they should be condemned in the strongest possible terms, and they should be brought to justice.
You can understand how offensive many Americans find the footage of these Palestinians in the West Bank. They're celebrating and passing out candy and cheering and showing victory.
I find it offensive myself too, but what can you do? Those are young teenagers. I saw them on CNN, and we should not take them as representatives of the Palestinian people. There are 7 million Palestinians around. What you saw is about 50 or 60 Palestinian teenagers or young guys in the streets who are angry at the Israelis.
Mr. Rahman, who anywhere in the world, in your mind, has such a large grudge against the United States that they would want to carry out such an act?
Again, as I said, it would be very imprudent for me and irresponsible to try to speculate at this point.
Okay, but can you say definitively that there is no Palestinian organization that at least that I want to put a finer point on it, that even has the kind of sophisticated coordination and planning and perhaps even weaponry to coordinate something that is...
Listen, I would say that President Arafat made a statement to that effect. All the Palestinian organizations did the same thing, including Hamas and others. So I have no reason to believe that there is Palestinian involvement in it. And as I said, whoever is responsible, whether it is Palestinian, American, Jewish, Christian, Hindus, they should be punished for this crime.
Mr. Rahman, if you wouldn't mind hanging on just a second. Mr. Eagleberger, you've heard Mr. Rahman. Do you believe that the protestations and the quick statements to avoid blame are to be believed from the Taliban or the Palestinians or anybody?
Well, I think you have to parse it out. First of all, we all know perfectly well that the Taliban has been housing and comforting Osama bin Laden for years. Whether they had
and motivation, that our technical ability to gather information stays as world-class as it has been for the last 50 years, and we need to close the gap between the amount of information we gather and that which we're able to analyze and convert into useful intelligence.
Okay. Senator Bob Graham, Democrat from Florida, the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, joining us here. He's about to receive a briefing, Judy, and we will get back to you with word when we know more from here. Judy?
All right, Kate, we've been listening closely to what Senator Graham was saying, and I would just remind everyone, if they haven't already taken note of this, that this week is actually the anniversary of the Camp David Accords. Those took place back in 1978, 23 years ago, over a period of about a little more than a week between September 5th and about the 17th. This was the framework for peace in the Middle East, an agreement between Israel and Egypt that many of the more hardline Arab states said they would never forgive Egypt and certainly Israel for doing this. They felt betrayed by it, and there are those today suggesting perhaps that had something to do with the timing, although at this point it would be purely speculation to say one way or another. You're continuing to see pictures of the terrible devastation in New York City in the aftermath of the 2 airplanes that flew into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. There are adjacent buildings, part of the World Trade Center complex, that are still very much at risk. One of these buildings may have collapsed or may be in the process of collapsing. Aaron Brown, back to you in Manhattan.
Judy, thank you. Jim DeStefano is a structural engineer. He knows about big buildings and what happens in these sort of catastrophic moments. He joins us from Deerfield, Connecticut on the phone. Jim, the plane hits. And I hope this isn't a terribly oversimplified question, but what happens to the building itself?
Well, it's
the structure.
Yeah, it's a tremendous impact that's applied to the building when a collision like this occurs. And it's clear that that impact was sufficient to do damage to the columns and the bracing system supporting the building. That coupled with the fire raging and the high temperatures softening the structural steel then precipitated a destabilization of the columns, and clearly the columns buckled at the lower floors, causing the building to collapse.
So it is a combination of, as we see again this extraordinary shot of the second plane hitting the tower, it is a combination of the impact of the plane itself and then the fire that ensues that causes these, I don't know, are they called beams, to buckle?
It's the columns. The vertical elements are columns, and those are the elements that are holding the whole building up. And those are the critical, vulnerable elements that clearly failed in a buckling mode from the high temperatures and the damage from the impact.
Now, I'm not asking you to assign any blame to anyone about anything here, but just give me an idea if, in fact, you can design these buildings in such a way so that this sort of thing does not happen even in a catastrophic event.
Well, it's very difficult when you're designing a structure like this to imagine all the scenarios of things that might occur to the building during its construction. It's my understanding that when this building was designed, one of the criteria that it was designed for was a direct hit from a 707. Clearly, planes are larger today, and it wasn't considered the effects of the aftermath fires and high temperatures that would have been applied to the structure subsequent to the collision, as we saw today.
And to the best that you can, give me an idea of how long it will take for that building to be safe to go into, because what we know is or what we believe at least, there are still people trapped in there. The mayor talked about a week that this rescue operation is going to take. Is that realistic?
I think it's very realistic that what we've seen in other collapses, like L'Ambiance Plaza here in Connecticut and the Hyatt Regency in Kansas City and the Oklahoma City bombing, it takes a very long time to clear the rubble and find all the people that might be trapped underneath it.
But at what point, what has to happen before it is literally safe to send someone into that space?
I don't know that it will ever be safe. I think the rescue people that are in there trying to save people are very much at risk, as they always are in these kinds of disasters. That the structure is always, when you have a pile of rubble like this, the structure is always somewhat unstable. So those rescue workers that are in there are at some risk. That there's never a point where you can say this building is safe to walk into and start looking around.
Jim, thank you. Jim DeStefano, a structural engineer, joining us from Deerfield, Connecticut on the phone. We have, over the last 6 or 7 hours now, shown you some extraordinary pictures. Many of those pictures have come from the air. We have seen the plane hitting the tower. We've seen the tower collapse. In this day and age, lots of people walk around this city, and every city, I guess, with video cameras, and one of them today in Lower Manhattan was Dr. Mark Heath. Dr. Heath kept rolling, as we say in the news business, and this is what he saw with as little commentary from us as possible.
I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car. It's incredible. Okay, I'm gonna have to go find people who need help, because I don't think I'm one of them. You okay, sir? Okay. Can I just get a toot off your respirator? Can I get a toot? I'm just in a couple of clean breaths. That's good. Okay. Back to you. This is the car I hid behind. It saved my life. Oh, wait, maybe it was this one. There's all these noises. I don't know what it is. They say someone needs help.
Yeah, Mike! Mike! Mike, come over here! Yeah!
Anybody need a doctor?
Where are you?
Oxygen. Don't have oxygen.
Hello, Doc.
Hey, that guy needs some oxygen if someone can share it with him.
10-4.
Thanks. They told me just to wait here at this semi-staging area. See if I can help, so that's what I'm doing. They won't let me go any closer. No one can go in to get the people out. There's small explosions still going on. So far, I've just seen some people who needed oxygen from the dust. And that was one trauma. Gonna go wash my eyes out. Yeah, that almost made it worse. Looking north on the West Side Highway. You guys going in?
Yeah.
Come with you. You know, you might not want to get too much closer because the more buildings could come down, then we're not going to help anybody.
All right.
I think we should. Yeah.
Where's the incident come out?
Let's just. Yeah. Okay. Let's just wait right here. Let's just station up right here. Okay.
All right, Doc.
Why don't we set up? Can you hang IVs from this pole here?
Okay.
Okay.
Where'd you get gloves there, buddy?
Yeah. We just heard another explosion. They're handing out gloves and masks. The consensus is it's too unsafe to go in there. Just gonna wait here until they bring some people out. I was hooked up with some firemen with some first aid stuff.
What are we gonna
You know what?
Anything?
Why don't we just set this up as a little mobile hospital unit right here, okay? Any suggestions? Should we set up here for medical work? Think this is safe enough here?
Those pictures shot by Dr. Mark Heath. We don't know much about Dr. Heath, but we, I think, can fairly say that he had extraordinary presence of mind as he continued not only shooting those pictures, but also offering assistance where he could. At one point, he hid behind a car, tried to get into the car to protect himself from both the debris and the smoke that was building around him. The car was locked. He tried to break in, couldn't, and then hid his face in a medical bag, his medical bag. All the while he kept shooting. A couple of things that you might have wondered about. A couple of sounds. There was a chirping sound that you heard at various points in the tape. That is the sound of the locator devices that firemen and women wear so that if they are lost in a fire, their colleagues, their brother and sister firefighters can get to them. And there was also a kind, what sounded to us at least, like a kind of whistling sound. That's the sound of respirators that the firemen, the emergency service personnel, and the rest were using and offering to people who needed it. Our colleagues at CNN-FN are reporting now that the stock exchanges, the NASDAQ, the American Stock Exchange, the New York Stock Exchange, all of course closed today, will remain closed through Wednesday. So the stock markets, the financial markets in the country, and yet again, we cannot recall anything like that ever occurring. Perhaps it has and we don't remember it, but we don't remember it. The stock markets, all of them, stay closed through Wednesday. Air travel shut down in the United States until at least noon tomorrow, and certainly no guarantee it'll open after that. That affects on an average about 1.5 million people every single day, 40 to 50,000 flights, all of them grounded. There were about 50,000, there were about 50 planes in the air after the FAA essentially locked down airports in the country. All of those planes made it safely to destinations. We don't know they made it to the destinations they were headed for, but they were all able to land safely. CNN's Joey Chin in Atlanta. Joey?
Aaron, we're following and watching these extraordinary pictures as they still come in as we continue to watch all the events. We want to bring our viewers back to where all of this started today, and we have additional pictures to give you some additional perspective to the story we are telling you this afternoon. First up, we go back to 8:48 this morning, that is Eastern. The crash of the first hijacked airliner hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan in New York. You see the gaping hole and you see the black smoke that billowed from the tower. Now this, actually you're looking at the picture of the second airline that crashed into the second tower, the South Tower as well. Now we want to move you over and show you some exclusive CNN pictures, still pictures of the second crash as it happened. You see the plane bearing in on the South Tower of the Trade Center. This is United Airlines Flight 175. It was a Boeing 767 scheduled from Boston to Los Angeles, 65 people on board, and you see what happened, just sheared right into the South Tower. Horrible crash, massive burst of flames. This crash occurred at 4 minutes after 9 o'clock this morning. Again, that's New York time. Now move ahead to 10:30, 10:29 actually. The North Tower had collapsed already. This is the South Tower. You can see collapsing into the streets of Lower Manhattan, just falling away. We know that as you see it there, it's just falling away, just falling out of the sky, falling into pieces all over Lower Manhattan, and so you can understand the tremendous amount of ash just dumped on Lower Manhattan today. Roughly 50,000 people work in the towers in the center area on a daily basis, and then of course there are additional tens of thousands of tourists who would come to the tourists who want to see the tremendous vantage point you would have from the top of the towers. The New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani has told us he does believe that there was a horrendous loss of life there, but he doesn't even want to try to guess how many people have died in New York today. Here now we want to give you the eyewitness accounts of people who saw some of what happened today.
I heard the sound of a jet. I assumed it was like a Navy jet or something like that, just flying by. Sometimes they'll fly very low near the World Trade Center, not near it. Then I heard a large explosion. I thought it was a sonic boom. And when I heard the explosion, I looked up, and what I saw was red, and I saw debris start to fall down. I was so close to the building that I couldn't run away from the building, so I actually had to run towards it. If you know, the World Financial Center has got a rib design, so you actually have a 2x2 space where you can actually sneak into the building and hide. Myself and one other man were there. We had our book bags over our heads. Debris was falling down about the size of this. All portions of the building were falling down. That went on for about 30 or 40 seconds, and that for me was the worst part of this whole experience for me, because I feared for my own life at that time. Well, after that stopped, I walked out myself. I didn't see anybody in the plaza, so nobody was hurt was in the plaza at that point. I walked to my building in the World Financial Center. I'd seen that my colleagues who had evacuated the building were downstairs. Now, on the west side of the World Financial Center, which is right on the Hudson River, there's an outdoor plaza, okay? You can look over the World Financial Center and see the World Trade Center. We were looking back at the building in flames. This is probably 5 after 9, 10 after 9, and we see a second commercial jet flying extremely low. actually collide into the south tower of the building. At that point, we decided just to get out of there. People were just going crazy at that point, evacuating. We started to walk north and ultimately got up to here. During our walk, we saw the south tower collapse to the ground, decimated, and then later, it was very amazing to see the north tower standing there by itself after years and years and years of seeing them together. And then all of a sudden, the north tower just collapsed upon itself and just fell to the ground. It was a cloud of dust that covered all of downtown Manhattan, Battery Park and everything. It's phenomenal. I've never seen anything like it.
The eyewitness description of the horrible scene in New York City this morning. And in the midst of all of that, in the midst of that terrible tragedy, there was further chaos down in Washington. 9:45 this morning, an airliner crashing into the Pentagon. The plane, which was American Airlines Flight 77, which was scheduled from Washington's Dulles Airport out to Los Angeles. The Boeing 757 hit the Army side of this huge fortress that is the Pentagon. The Pentagon, of course, is not just a symbol of the nation's military might, but today is a command center amidst all that has happened. Now, there was a fourth crash, which occurred today in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. United Airlines Flight 93 was bound from Newark in New Jersey out to San Francisco. There were 45 people on board. Authorities say there were no survivors. In all, there were 4 crashes, 266 passengers and crew, and then, of course, we still have no idea how many people may have died on the ground in the course of all these catastrophes. Joining us now from Dallas, Texas is Jeffrey Beatty. He's a counterterrorism expert who had done work on the first World Trade Center attack. That was back in 1993. As well, he's done some work for the Pentagon. Of course, there will be a lot of trying to read through all of this, Mr. Beatty. Is there something that you have seen in the events of today that you see as perhaps a symbol of what group might be involved or some other hallmark of terrorism here?
Well, I think it's a little too early to speculate on what group might be involved, Joey. If you remember back to the Oklahoma City bombing, everyone rushed to judgment to think it was perhaps overseas-based terrorism. Now, while all the indicators are going in that direction, it'd probably be prudent to just focus on the rescue efforts today and also to ask ourselves, you know, how did this happen? And kind of break down the operation and show people that this was a very low-tech but high-concept operation on the part of the terrorists.
Well, describe that for us. What do you mean by that? High concept.
Well, what I mean by that is, you know, Americans tend to rely on high tech. We look to high tech to solve most of our problems. Terrorists don't have high tech at their disposal to the degree that a government such as the United States has. But unfortunately, they have a lot of time. An operation such as this may have been years in the making. We don't know yet how this operation was able to go forward, but let's just, you know, break down the steps. I took a few notes on it. At some point, we all recognized that there was some intelligence failure, that, you know, we've got to do better. We've done good in the past, we've improved our ability to defeat terrorism, but we're not perfect yet, and this is an example of that, to be sure. But then what happened was, the question is, how did these people get some sort of weapon onto an airplane? You know, I'm sure the FAA and the Department of Transportation and all the airports from which these aircraft were launched this morning will be taking a really hard look at that, and I'm sure we'll see some changes in the future.
Not an airplane, Mr. Beatty. I mean, 4 aircraft. That's an awful lot in different locations.
Exactly. This is a highly sophisticated approach, you know, but it's not the first time we've seen that. We've seen foreign groups destroy 2 embassies within moments of each other a couple of years ago on the continent of Africa. So we know that our opponent is capable of this type of operation, and he demonstrated it today on our homeland. The interesting thing here, Joey, you didn't need to bring across hundreds of pounds of explosives across a border someplace to commandeer an airplane. Why did they choose these airplanes? They picked these wide-body airplanes. The fact that the World Trade Center was prepared to sustain a hit from a 707 was not a well-kept secret. They picked airplanes that were bigger than that. Also, they picked airplanes that took off from the East Coast, headed to the West Coast, that were big airplanes full of fuel. They weren't interested in killing people on the airplanes. The airplane themselves became the bomb. And so they didn't need to bring explosives into the country. We don't know yet whether it was knives or handguns or whatever. But the next question in the step as we break down the operational acts in this attack is, how did these people get weapons onto the aircraft? And then from there, to continue it, the question is asked, what about a cockpit incursion? How is it that they were able to get into the cockpits of the aircraft, take over the controls, and as we know and have heard in the past that there are transponder codes that pilots can send if an aircraft is hijacked, From what I understand, we didn't get some of that yet, so we have to assume that the cockpits were burst into rather quickly. And I heard Judy Woodruff and others earlier infer, and I join them in drawing the same inference, that it's highly doubtful that the pilots of these aircraft, the United Airlines pilots and the American Airlines pilots, were at the controls of these aircraft when they impacted their targets. So we have got to assume and infer that people capable of flying the aircraft, and remember these aircraft are on duty all over the world, these perpetrators no doubt rehearsed this operation, rehearsed breaking into the cockpit and other locations, that they were probably piloted to the target by people capable of flying a military or a jet aircraft.
What do you come down to the... Do you think, I mean, I have to interrupt you to ask, do you think that perhaps in looking at the possibility of terror threats, I mean, certainly terror threats have come to this country in the past, and I'm wondering if you think perhaps we were thinking too high concept. We thought of something more elaborate, and perhaps intelligence should have been focused on this kind of low-tech approach. I suppose hindsight is 20/20, but...
I think there's a lot of good in what you're pointing out, Joey. We have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. You know, we cannot just focus all our energies on weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, etc. We've all been talking about that, and hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on that in recent years. But this didn't use any weapon of mass destruction, and I'm afraid that the casualty tally could approach 5 figures. And that means that we've got to be, to beat these people, not only high tech, but we've got to be high concept. It means we've got to work harder in planning than we have up to this point. And I know that we will. And if I could say a word about the people at the World Trade Center and at the Pentagon, we've had the privilege in my company to work to support both organizations. We've trained every security officer at both locations. They knew what they were up against. They knew that they were icons, American icons, that were likely to be targeted. Excuse me, it's been an emotional day, plus it's a little hot out here. Likely to be targeted. And they did their best. But they were only one part of a system, as we've just outlined. You know, Doug Karpiloff, the Director of Life Safety and Security for the World Trade Center, is probably one of the premier security people in our country. Doug was always afraid of a scenario where there was a mass casualty incident at the World Trade Center and hundreds of emergency vehicles would rush to the scene. They don't have the ability to check all those vehicles to make sure that they don't pose a threat. So we're yet to determine, we've heard reports of secondary explosions after the aircraft impacted, whether in fact there wasn't something else at the base of the towers that in fact were the coup de grace to bring them to the ground.
Mr. Beatty, we appreciate all of your insight. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave you. There are still further developments on this story. Jeffrey Beatty's company is involved in counterterrorism information, and he joined us this afternoon from Dallas. Now let's go back to New York for the latest information there in Aaron Brown.
Joey, thank you. A couple of things. The president is en route back to Washington, we are now told. The president had started his day in Sarasota, Florida, then went to Shreveport, a military base outside Shreveport, then went to Nebraska, where the Strategic Air Command is located, and now he is making his way back to Washington. And we are told the president will address the nation at some point tonight. We do not know at what time, but of course, when it happens, we will carry that live as well. We're also getting reports that a second building in the complex of the Trade Center, and again, you have the 2 towers, but then you have a number of support buildings around it, that another of those buildings, we reported a bit ago on Building 7, we now report that there are problems in Building 5, and that may be collapsing as well, but at least there is fire there. There are enormous logistical problems. We just looked down what is 8th Avenue behind us here, which is normally at this time of the day packed with cars. This is rush hour, people trying to get out of the city. It is empty, and the city, in at least this part of the city, Manhattan, is shut down, which means that thousands of people who are trying to get home, trying to get to the suburbs, trying to get to Long Island, trying to get to New Jersey particularly. That's where those trains, what are called the PATH trains, come into New Jersey, from New Jersey rather, at the Trade Center. All of them stranded here. CNN's Richard Roth is down on the streets of New York and is talking to some of the people who I suspect are wondering when they will get home. Richard?
People that you would have seen in locations you were just examining. Many thousands are here right now on the west side of Manhattan trying to escape from New York. New York City is sending them to ferries that are taking them to New Jersey. New York City bridges, we're told, are open for pedestrians. The tunnels for trains to take the thousands here were closed. Many of these people stunned, shocked, silence. I mean, you've never heard so many New Yorkers so quiet in your life. And many of them just have to look over their shoulders to see what they escaped as these two towers were leveled. New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani called it one of the most heinous acts in United States history. He says he fears that the death toll may be more than New York can bear. He asked all New Yorkers to say a prayer. He said a rescue effort was beginning, but as we were told by one official with the New York, New Jersey Port Authority, there is so much jet fuel, furniture, paper, everything still going on up in smoke. He didn't want to send in his people to begin any type of detailed rescue effort. There are reports of some people alive, many dead down there. Scores, hundreds of emergency vehicles with their sirens have been roaring down Manhattan's west side here to the scene, carrying federal security people, all kinds. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani said that there are more than 1,000 people taken to what's known as Liberty State Park, the walking wounded, he called them, several hundred, 600 or so in New York City hospitals. And the mayor said that there are 170 hospitals that are up and running, and other buildings are helping out for support. U.S. jet fighters overhead, circling occasionally, people craning their necks, looking up in the sky. Everybody's got a memory, everybody's got a story here. I personally saw Trade Tower #1, where CNN's New York bureau used to be in the lobby 17, 18 years ago, come tumbling down, and I was part of a stampede as people just raced for their lives as the smoke came closer and closer to all of us. That was after Tower #2 had gone down. You couldn't even see what was left of it, if anything was standing, due to all of the smoke. Aaron.
Richard, just help orient me for a second. Tell me where you are in the city right now as you talk to us.
We're on approximately 33rd Street on the west side of Manhattan. The Hudson River is just behind our camera position here, and it is an orderly departure here. I mean, you can see for yourself. People are just, they left work early, they were ordered out. The city is on high alert, no flights, and people are headed to New Jersey. Many of them would be at the ferry at this time on a normal day. This is certainly not a very normal day in New York City.
It certainly is not, Richard. Thank you. It is, I don't know if remarkable is the right word, but it's worth noting again that in every picture that we have seen from the scene, the people who had just experienced the most horrendous imaginable thing were remarkably orderly and calm as they left the area. I don't want to suggest for a second that there wasn't any panic, that there wasn't any screaming. These are human beings, and human beings behave in a variety of ways. But every picture we have seen, New Yorkers calmly, if that's the right word, calmly left the scene, moved out of the area. No reports of trouble at all as firefighters and police personnel came down into the city. Scores, hundreds of civilians started to move out. And they are still calmly moving out. We suspect there is some sense of shock as they try and figure out what has happened to their city, what has happened to their lives, and perhaps most importantly, what has happened to their friends and their co-workers who may not have gotten out of those buildings today. One of the problems that the city is faced with is, and as Richard alluded to, is moving people around. You have essentially a shutdown going on here. In some of the outlying areas, city governments are trying to support the city as best they can. Tom Swayze is the mayor of Glen Cove out on Long Island. Tom, I think you're on the phone. Mr. Mayor, can you hear me?
Yes, this is Tom Swayze, mayor of the city of Glen Cove.
Tom, tell us what Glen Cove is doing to support the efforts going on here in Manhattan.
We have high-speed ferries that operate from Glen Cove to Pier 11 down by Wall Street. And we've already evacuated about 1,200 people with the help of Fox Navigation from New York City out here back to the island. We are now working at the request of Commissioner Carrick to try and bring emergency personnel, doctors, nurses back into Manhattan to try and help relieve some of these doctors and nurses that are going to start getting very exhausted at the area hospitals down on the southern tip of Manhattan.
And is there a number people should call or a location they ought to go to if they are medical personnel and can help in the effort down there, where they can get on one of these ferries and come on down?
we'd like them to come to the end of Glen Cove Road, the northern end of Glen Cove Road in Glen Cove, to the parking lot across from our police station, the end of Glen Cove Road, across from the Glen Cove Police Station, where we will take them by bus down to the ferry terminal. If they want to call for information, they should call the ferry terminal itself at 609-3342, 609-3342. We're coordinating with the Nassau County and Suffolk County emergency management offices as well, but right now we need to get emergency-type personnel, doctors, nurses, EMTs. We know everybody wants to help, but we're not looking for just regular volunteers who mean well, and we appreciate their interest. We're looking for professionals who can go into Manhattan and be prepared to work.
Tom, thank you for joining us and for your efforts today. I apologize for mispronouncing your name a moment ago. Thank you. Judy in Washington.
Aaron, we're here in the Washington studio, and among others, I'm joined by former U.S. Secretary of State Alexander Haig, former Army General Haig. You were, of course, Secretary of State during the Ronald Reagan administration. And Mr. Secretary, you were in that post at a time of a national emergency, the assassination attempt on the life of President Reagan. And what I want to specifically ask you about is, what is it like for the people on the inside, the heartbeat of government, when something horrific like this happens? Of course, this is a very different situation, but what is it like when you have to react to something?
Well, I think most people wait and look for direction. And so it's very important that they have it. If they don't, they sometimes sit in shocked inaction. And so you have to have that. And that's the critical aspect of moving through a crisis of this kind.
And we've heard from President Bush now at 3 different intervals today, when he was still in Florida, when he moved on to Louisiana, and then a statement when he was in Nebraska. Now we know he's back to Washington. Now let me ask you, he's coming back to the Washington area. We don't know where he's going to go. Vice President Cheney at an undisclosed location. The Speaker of the House, second in line to the presidency, at an undisclosed location. I'm not asking you to tell us where they are, but what would it be like in one of these locations where they were essentially kept away and kept safe?
Well, all of these installations have been established for precisely this reason. And that means that they're armed with communications, with living facilities, and that's the situation. Now, they don't exercise them all as regularly as I suppose we used to during the nuclear era, but they still exercise them, and they're very, very efficient facilities.
You're saying they don't exercise, presumably because it's felt that the threat isn't as serious in the post-Cold War world?
Well, it's, you know, government is tough, and people are always responding to the crisis of the moment. Usually it's in the first headlines in the daily press. So many times they don't get to go to these relocation sites as often as we'd like, and I used to have to push that when I was in the National Security Council.
The exercises where you would practice what you would do in an emergency. But once they're at the site, I mean, are we talking about very spare surroundings, bare walls, canned goods for food?
No.
I mean, what are we talking about?
It varies. It varies. Of course, there's an airborne facility. We all know that there is an airborne facility for the president, and that's Andrews Air Force Base. There are other facilities, some very, very close and some more distant, which were anticipated might be required in a nuclear attack.
What about the lines of communication? You mentioned that. That was the first point you made, that once they're at these locations, there has to be communications. How up to date is all that?
Well, it's kept pretty well up to date. I know, for example, the day President Reagan was shot, it was very clear to me that that command post, that command and control center, had to be in the west basement of the White House or in one of these alternate emergency facilities, because they were equipped to do precisely that. Now, since that time, we've improved the State Department communication facilities, and the Pentagon, of course, is very well equipped in that regard. So there are 3 locations that you could run a crisis from that are known, but there are others.
General Haig, what do you say to those Americans watching this horrific set of circumstances unfold on television? before them and wondering, is America safe? Is America safe? Do I feel safe getting on an airplane and flying somewhere? Am I safe to go into a tall building in Manhattan, to walk into a federal building in Washington, D.C., anywhere, whether it's touring the White House or the Capitol? I mean, what has today done to our sense of safety?
Yeah, the answer to your question, Judy, is obviously whatever we've done heretofore has not been adequate from the standpoint of your question. And that's been a product of a number of things. It's what I call the modern day rationalization of conflict situations, and what I call the development of moral equivalence between the terrorist, who's the perpetrator of the illegal act, where innocent civilians, non-combatants, women, children, everyone are involved, and the defenders against those attacks are equated morally because of some perception of a lack of social justice on one side or the other. And, you know, we're very great, we're moralists here in this country, and we do that. The simple facts are that national leadership has to establish that terrorism is an illegal act of such magnitude now that it overwhelms the issues of social justice, which cause us to quibble and restrain us at a time when a crime of this nature has been executed.
You're saying even over individual liberties in some instances?
Well, sometimes yes, and that's an unfortunate statement as an advocate of those very liberties. But yes, sometimes.
Former Secretary of State Alexander Haig, Army General Alexander Haig, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Judy.
We appreciate it. And we just heard General Haig talking about terrorism and how much greater a presence it is in our lives than we had expected. We're told that tomorrow the Congress will convene at 10 o'clock in the morning. We're told that they plan to pass a resolution or resolutions condemning terrorism and then immediately adjourn. You're looking at a live picture of the United States Capitol, the flag flying at half staff there. Now that is the White House, that's next to the Executive Office building, but the other picture we saw was a flag flying at half staff near the United States Capitol building. Now back to Joey Chen in Atlanta.
Judy, thanks very much. Joined here on this set by Miles O'Brien, who is our resident pilot and certainly has quite a bit of understanding about the wheres and why-fors and what significance they might have in putting together what happened. Miles has some additional information now, and that's really important to understanding who might have done this and why.
Well, this is sort of our first clue as to what's going on. Obviously, more information will come out as the air traffic control tapes and hopefully the cockpit voice recordings come out. But just take a look at this. This is actual archival information from the radar tracks from the FAA ground centers. And these are the two planes which ultimately ended up at the World Trade Centers, the two towers. Both of them left Boston within 15 minutes of each other. Both were headed to Los Angeles, perhaps no coincidence, heavily laden with fuel. Both of them made extreme and noticeable deviations and were heading in the wrong direction for 30, perhaps 40 minutes, thus clearly giving air traffic controllers quite a bit of attention. There must have been some communication back and forth. It's unclear now.
This is certainly something the air traffic control folks would have seen. They would have seen these things
clearly.
coming up close.
And the fact that two planes were doing this must have seemed odd. We don't know what the conversations were, but suffice to say that would be odd. Now take a look at this flight. This is United 93. This took off from Dulles Airport, was headed for San Francisco. Once again, a coast-to-coast flight, heavily laden with fuel, flew on out from Newark to about Cleveland, then took its dogleg, was headed pretty much to the DC area, and then disappeared off the radar screens right here outside of the Pittsburgh area, a place called Shanksville. We don't know what happened there. What's kind of odd about this one, Joey, is that at some point after flying past Pittsburgh, the pilot apparently radioed and changed his destination to DCA, which is Ronald Reagan National Airport. Unclear what that means. Now let me just kind of put this all onto one graphic, if you will. If we can put up that graphic, and I'll use the telestrator to show you exactly what's going on. All right, here are the important cities. First of all, let's take a look at 8 a.m. and see what happens at 8 a.m. And that was the first departure. Okay, this is the flight, American Airlines Flight 11 was headed out this way to Los Angeles, 81 passengers, 11 crew member. Now, 8:15. United Flight 175 heads out a little different route across, also headed for Los Angeles. That was at 8:15. 8:21 a.m., Dulles Airport is your location, and that is American Airlines Flight 77, a 757, 58 passengers and crew. It headed off onto Los Angeles. We don't have a radar track on this, so I'm doing a little bit of speculation there. Finally, United Airlines Flight 93 at 8:43 as it departs Newark Airport and begins its trip all the way over to Cleveland. Now, let's get the impact times here. 8:45, the flight, American Airlines Flight 11, impacts in New York at the World Trade Center. 9:03, the United Flight 175 impacts at the World Trade Center. 9:45 a.m., and of course all these times are Eastern times, the flight, American Airlines flight that was headed from Dulles to Dulles to Los Angeles, hits at the excuse me, I should have been drawing that to New York. I was drawing it to Washington. Hits at the Pentagon. My apologies on that. And then finally, United Air Flight 93 ends up in outside of Pittsburgh. That made a bit of a hash there, but that gives you a sense of how well coordinated this was and how sophisticated an operation this was. A couple of points to remember. The fact that if you can fly a 757, you can fly a 767, identical cockpits, so if you were training somebody to fly that aircraft, they're more or less interchangeable. But the point that is worth mentioning here is you had 4 large airliners on transcontinental flights with extreme deviations. The air traffic control system clearly was upset by this. I'm very curious to hear what they have to say about the radio transmissions and whether at some point the big picture was ever analyzed. It's done by individual centers. Maybe the big picture wasn't analyzed.
Miles O'Brien, our correspondent, thanks very much for your insight into all this. Now we return to Aaron Brown up in New York. Aaron.
Joey, Miles, thank you. That is a great point. You do wonder if air traffic controllers were ever able to put the pieces together, and if they were, what they must have thought, what went through their minds this morning when they realized that they had not one anomaly, but that they had several going on at the same time, all one heading to Washington and 2 heading here in New York. CNN's Tim O'Brien has been working the phones, as all of us have been throughout the day, and he joins us from Washington with an extraordinary piece of information on the Pentagon crash. Tim, are you there?
I am. Our understanding is that Barbara Olson was on the plane, a frequent commentator on CNN and the wife of Solicitor General Ted Olson. She called her husband twice during the hijacking to tell him the plane had been hijacked. And they lost contact once, and she called back. After the first call, Olson called the command center at the Justice Department to inform them of this hijacking, and they said they knew nothing about it but would track it down. Barbara Olson told Ted the following story, that all the passengers were herded to the back of the plane, including the flight personnel, including the pilot. And the only weapons she mentioned were knives and cardboard cutters. You would think if there were a machine gun or any other kind of gun that she would have mentioned that. But the only weapons she mentioned were knives and cardboard cutters. I asked Ted if she made any reference to nationality of the hijackers or any suspicions about the motive, and he said she made no reference to that at all. They didn't have a whole lot of time to talk. She said to Ted, "What do I tell the pilot to do?" Somewhat typical of Barbara, a take charge kind of person. But there was nothing they could do, and they're all trapped in the back of the plane.
Did she, or was she able to tell Mr. Olson how many hijackers were on board the plane? Or at least how many she may have seen?
I asked Ted that. He said, no, but she referred to them as more than one. More than one. Incidentally, she wasn't even supposed to be on this flight. She was booked on a flight yesterday, but today is Ted's birthday, so she wanted to be here this morning to have breakfast with him before she left.
And
sad story.
It's a horrible story, and one can only assume that it is one of many horrible stories that we will hear in the hours ahead. It says something about the world we live in, that people, while this was going on, were able to make cell phone calls. We heard earlier today of another call that was made from a plane, that there was some awareness on the ground perhaps not formal awareness, but some awareness of what was going on, at least on some of those, excuse me, on some of those planes. Mr. Olson must be devastated.
Well, you can imagine. He's surrounded by friends, but this is tough for everybody. It's tough for the country, but it's particularly tough for the loved ones.
It is indeed. Tim, thank you for your efforts.
Sure.
Thank you for your efforts today. We appreciate that. Again, Barbara Olson, one of the 200 plus passengers on 4 different airliners, and we have no reason to believe that any of those people survived the crashes today here in New York, in Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh, and at the Pentagon in Washington. We still do not have a very good feel, to be perfectly honest, for how many people have died today. We have no particular feel, to be perfectly honest, how many people have been injured. We can only surmise that we are talking in the hundreds, the thousands of people certainly have been injured today. How many of those will survive, we do not yet know. Judy?
And Aaron, this may be another point where we want to say, God bless the souls of those who have lost their lives today or who are dying as we speak in hospitals and in places where they cannot be reached. I think even those out there who may not believe that there is a God, at a time like this, we all reach out for a higher being, and we want to believe that there is someone who can bring us salvation. Jamie McIntyre at the Pentagon, questions today about the whereabouts of some of the top people in government in the United States. We've known the president's been flying around the country, the vice president's been out of sight. The Secretary